Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is Washington the Rebel. Now, usually when we think of the rebellion leading up to the Revolutionary War in the 1760s and 1770s, Washington is not one of the first names that we think of when it comes to being a rebel, at least a leading one. We get names like Patrick Henry, his fellow Virginian. In Massachusetts, you've got Sam and John Adams who are leading the way. And then the writers, people like Tom Paine with Common Sense, Ben Franklin, and eventually Thomas Jefferson. These are the ones we think of as the really fomenting the rebellion. But Washington, in his own sort of quiet way, was very much of a rebel from the time that the British passed the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, Washington is already resenting the British. He's been intertwined with them, the mother country, for most of his life. From a military standpoint, he had tried to advance in the British military in the 1750s and eventually figured out that no colonial was ever going to get his just due in the British military, something he resents, and eventually he leaves. From an economic standpoint, Washington's a businessman, a planter, a farmer, but he is tied at the hip with his agent, Carey and Company in England, who has a lot of say in how Washington can go about things. And again, Washington resents this relationship because in a way he feels powerless in it. Well, now England comes along and says, you know what, colonies? You guys need to pitch in economically. We helped you in this recent war with the French. We provide all this protection for you. It's time for you to pay your fair share in taxes. And they passed this Stamp Act, which required on all paper products and official documents the colonials to buy a stamp to pay that tax. This is the first time that the British had actually imposed a direct tax on the colonies, and this was done, of course, without the representation of the colonies directly in Parliament. So there's an uproar in the colonies over this act, and George Washington is among those who was highly offended. Washington writes about the Stamp Act that it's an act of oppression, for that act could be looked upon in no other light by every person who would view it in its proper colors. Now, Washington is a politician by now. He's a member of the House of Burgesses in the colony of Virginia, but mostly the strong silent type. He attends the sessions, but he's not a very active member. He starts getting a little bit more active, though, after the passage of the Stamp Act. Now, the colonies object to the Stamp Act. Eventually, Britain repeals it, but then they pass other acts, the Townshend Acts, and other things that continue to impose hardships on the colonies that they feel are done sort of without their say and against their own rights. Washington, by 1769, is really starting to get agitated. And he writes a letter to his neighbor, George Mason, in which he says that no man should scruple or hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a blessing, on which all the good and evil of life depends, is clearly my opinion. He's talking about the rights of the colonials. And in 1769, he's already talking about a potential military option. Well, we move forward, and in Massachusetts is where a lot of the real angst is happening. You have the Boston Massacre in 1770, and then in 1773, after the Tea Act is passed, the colonials and the Sons of Liberty, they were called under Sam Adams, rebel against this act. They storm a couple of British ships with tea, send all that tea into the Boston harbor, and the King of England is outraged. He imposes what's called the Intolerable Acts in 1773, particularly on Massachusetts, but the rest of the colonies are now worried that they could be next. Washington says at the time about all of these intrusive acts, and particularly the ones that are vested in financial areas. He writes a letter to one of his friends who's a loyalist to the crown, and he says, I think the Parliament of Great Britain hath no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent than I have to put my hands into yours for money. It's a sense of right and wrong, and Washington is increasingly agitated by the entire affair. So now we're at a point where Washington is actually getting ready to once again talk about a military response. He helps lead an effort in 1774 in his nearby Fairfax County to produce what's called the Fairfax Resolves. In fact, Washington is the one who reads these resolves for the first time to the public. Part of this launch of these objections to the crown, Washington states very clearly, I am ready to raise 1,000 men, subsist them myself at my own expense, and march at their head to Boston. The source of arms talk is mostly going on in Massachusetts, but Washington has a kinship with his angst and concerns about the British, his penchant for military that he has from his past, and he is continuing to play that active, still somewhat silent. He's not as vocal as others, but he's very much a rebel with a cause. Well, that same year, 1774, the colonies decide to unite in what's called the First Continental Congress. And Washington is selected from Virginia to join an all-star crew of Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Edmund Pendleton, Benjamin Harrison. These are some of the leaders of the colony of Virginia. They all head to Philadelphia and meet with 12 or 11 other colonies. Georgia didn't go, but 12 colonies did. And Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, where they decide to send a petition to the Crown to pull back on these intolerable acts. But in the meantime, Washington gets very involved in putting up a non-importation policy, basically a boycott of British goods in the colonies. So again, doing his own part to lead the way, and he embraces that and no longer purchases any of the items on the banned list directly from England as soon as this passes. Well, the king refuses the entreaties to withdraw the intolerable acts, and so Congress reconvenes the following year, 1775, the Second Continental Congress, Independence Hall now in Philadelphia. Washington is sent back from his colony of Virginia. But now fighting has actually already started. The congressmen are not ready to declare independence, but there is fighting going on in Massachusetts, Concord, Lexington, Bunker Hill. Battles are occurring, and there's this sense that they need a national response, not just a local militia response in Massachusetts. This is the feeling within Congress. And so Washington has got an angle into potentially becoming the commanding general for this new American army. Well, one signal is he's the only one who shows up to Congress in a military uniform. He wears a colonel's uniform from the Virginia militia, similar to what he had worn when he was a colonel in the militia 17 years before. And so he's laying the seeds that, yeah, if there's a military need, I've got that background, and you may want to come to me. Well, the fact is there were many people who were being considered potentially for the commanding general. A gentleman by the name of Artemus Ward was already leading the militia in Massachusetts. It could have been him. Also from Massachusetts was John Hancock, the president of Congress. He definitely wanted to lead on the military side. Plus, you've got others who are colonials but had a lot of experience in the British military. You've got Horatio Gates, you've got General Lee, Charles Lee. So there are plenty of candidates. Why did Washington get picked? In many ways, it was political. John Adams, who was a rabble-rouser, certainly in amongst himself, and a leader in the Second Continental Congress, he was driving toward independence. He's from Massachusetts. He knows he needs a national response to this, a united response across the colonies. And what better way to do that than to have someone from the largest colony, Virginia, lead this more unified nationalist military response. So in June of 1775, June 15th, Adams stands up in Congress and gives a full-throated advocacy for George Washington to be the commanding general. After Adams comes on board, the vote is taken and everybody agrees Washington's their man. Now, Washington accepts the appointment the very next day, and he tells Congress when he accepts his commission, "Though I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for support of the glorious cause." Now, Washington was saying the right things. He was being humble in a way. Typically was a very confident man, but this was a rather large undertaking, and certainly nothing like Washington had been responsible for in his early days in the British military, when he had never run even a large regiment, let alone an entire army. But this was his new world in June of 1775. He accepts that commission, and the rebel is now off to war. That's George Washington, the Rebel, from the life of George Washington. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.